Welcome everybody. Chapter 18 is called Isaiah of Jerusalem, the Confidant of Kings. None of the books of the prophets makes for easy reading. Apart from the fact that these moulders of Israel's faith were so deeply involved in the politics of their day, with which we're quite unfamiliar, but which play a large part in their message. What they had to say about the affairs of their time generally took the form of short oracles, poetic in character, delivered on a particular occasion, and subsequently collected into book form by their disciples. Thus, a single chapter in one of the prophetic books might consist of a variety of these short utterances, spoken at different times and with no obvious connection or continuity. But to add to the difficulty, a single book of prophecy may well contain not only the words of the prophet himself, but also prophecies spoken by his followers. A prophet's disciples regarded themselves as echoing their master's thoughts, and therefore their contributions could properly be included under his name. The supreme example of this is the book of Isaiah, which contains not only oracles spoken by Isaiah himself, but even more which come from members of his school. In the case of this particular book, the collection covers a period of 300 years and includes prophecies which relate to vastly different situations. As sometimes happens, the work of one of the apprentices turns out to be more impressive than that of the master himself, although it appears in the Bible under the master's name. For convenience, therefore, we may single out two Isaiahs who made a distinctive contribution to Israel's thought, and therefore eventually to Christianity. The first, with whom we are concerned here, was the original Isaiah, the founder of the school, whom we may call Isaiah of Jerusalem. The name of the second, perhaps the greatest of the Old Testament prophets, is unknown, but his teaching is included under Isaiah's name, and it's simplest, therefore, to call him Isaiah of Babylon, which is where he flourished about 2 centuries after Isaiah of Jerusalem. We shall return to him later. The last two prophets we looked at, Amos and Hosea, were men of the people. Isaiah of Jerusalem was of aristocratic birth. He lived about the same time as Amos and Hosea, in the second half of the 8th century BC. But while they were concerned with what was happening in the northern kingdom, Israel, Isaiah was involved in the affairs of the smaller southern kingdom of Judah. In his lifetime, he saw the end of the northern kingdom and the threat from the dreaded Assyrian war machine hanging over his own country. Like Abraham, Moses, and later Jeremiah, Isaiah had a distinctive religious experience in which he recognized that he was being called by God and given a particular assignment. He himself describes what happened on this occasion. He was in the temple of Jerusalem when he had a sudden vision of God enthroned in majesty and surrounded by angelic figures who proclaimed his glory. This ecstatic glimpse of the sovereignty of God over his whole creation and of his utter holiness left its mark on Isaiah's subsequent preaching. But the essence of his vision was not so much a sense of the otherness and the remoteness of the divine being, as of his direct concern that the lives of men should reflect the holiness of their Creator. Isaiah was overwhelmed by the contrast between the God who'd revealed himself to him and the pitiful inadequacy of his own life and that of his countrymen. In contrition and penitence, he acknowledges his own failure and that of the whole people of God. And by a symbolic act, one of the winged seraphs in his vision assures him of forgiveness. Isaiah hears the voice of God saying, "Whom shall I send? Who will be our messenger?" And he makes the simple answer, "Here I am, send me." It was this dramatic act of consecration and self-dedication that launched Isaiah on his career as a prophet and determined the content of his message. For 40 years he was in the thick of public affairs, advising a succession of kings and statesmen who in this period sought to come to terms with the Assyrian menace. But behind the political shrewdness of Isaiah's advice on foreign policy was his deep appreciation of the moral issues that were at stake. Like Amos and Hosea, he denounced the evils of a society that claimed to be the people of Yahweh, but behaved like pagans. He pictures Yahweh as the farmer who plants a vineyard, tends it, guards it, and gives it all his care, only to find that instead of producing grapes, it produces sour berries. Oppression of the poor by the rich, drunkenness and luxurious living, bribery and greed, these are the characteristics of Isaiah's Judah, as they had been of Amos's Israel. Superstitious belief in the value of a religious ceremonial for its own sake, the endless offering of sacrificial animals in the temple, festivals, pilgrimage, and meaningless prayers, all this Isaiah declares is sheer hypocrisy when it's not matched by the right conduct. In the prophet's words, Yahweh is saying to his people, "When you stretch out your hands, I turn my eyes away. You may multiply your prayers, I shall not listen. Your hands are covered in blood. Wash, make yourselves clean. Take your wrongdoing out of my sight. Cease to do evil, learn to do good. Search for justice, help the oppressed. Be just to the orphan, plead for the widow." Solemnly, Isaiah warns his people that they will have to answer to God for the travesty of religion and morality of which they are guilty. And like all the prophets, he sees God as executing his judgment through political and natural disasters. The ordinary man thought of Assyria as the incarnation of evil, the ultimate enemy of Yahweh, since it was a threat to the life of his people. Isaiah, on the contrary, declares that Assyria, for all its godlessness, is the means the Lord will use to discipline his disobedient children. Yet, Isaiah could not believe that God would utterly annihilate his people. Beyond the impending disaster, he still saw grounds for hope. There would be a remnant who would survive, a faithful minority who would carry on the name and the mission of the people of God. This was an important insight, which in the long run proved to be true. When Judah and its capital Jerusalem were finally devastated, a remnant was in fact preserved to maintain the faith and standards that had been revealed to Israel. Centuries later, St. Paul had no doubt that Isaiah's prophecy about the remnant had been further fulfilled in the emergence of the church. But perhaps Isaiah's greatest contribution lay in his intuitive perception that the providence of God would eventually overrule the follies of men. He had no particular reason to be optimistic about the future, caught up as he was in the political intrigues of a tiny nation heading for collapse. Yet, he believed in better things to come because he believed in the sovereignty of God and in the ultimate triumph of God's purpose. Isaiah looked forward to a new golden age with a new and greater David to bring it into being. He believed that one day, beyond all the changes and chances of history, the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. It was this kind of hope that encouraged subsequent generations to pin their hopes on God despite the disasters that beset them. And it was words like these which led the first Christians to believe that with the coming of Christ, Isaiah's golden age was beginning to come true.